how do we keep going doing this work? Because it's not getting any easier, right? And maybe you have encountered this in yourself or with the people you work with. And so I want to take us a little bit on a journey of what it takes to, if you will, keep restoring our own souls, to keep doing this important work in a time that is rather challenging. So the place I want to start is actually with something that still speaks your language, which is the language of resilience. And whether you were more on the, in the salt marsh restoration or more in the eelgrass and kelp restoration, essentially what I kept hearing today it resonates with what a group of people actually in Sweden, but really done for the international community, has come up with as sort of the 9 must-knows of resilience. And a lot of those I heard in the subtext or explicitly today. For example, that resilience is absolutely critical for accelerating, for facing the accelerating risks that we're now facing on the coast, whether that's both from sea level rise, climate change, or biodiversity loss, or all the drivers that underlie that. So that's definitely here. I heard quite a bit in how beneficial, cost-effectively, it is to invest in resilience now to get back some of our fisheries, to get back some of the protection that we need for coastal communities. I heard a lot about learning and innovation, just a question at the end of this panel about what's not working, right? We have to keep learning in order to keep up with the best technology, the best science, and so on. Obviously, biodiversity is critical to building resilience, to thrive. Relationships among people, that was what this entire panel was just about, and I've heard it throughout. Dealing with the trade-offs that came up a little bit this morning in the session on successful adaptation and how we track it, to getting people engaged. How do you actually do that, right? It came through, and in the opening panel, certainly bringing more equity back into social equity into our work by hearing all the voices, bringing all the people to the table, and restoring some of the cultural practices that we're familiar with. I didn't hear as much on resilience requiring both coping, adapting, and transforming, and that's because we haven't had tomorrow yet. I think that's going to come tomorrow when you focus more on relocation and how does that look, how does that change the Cape and this area. So you might just say, so why would anybody not want that, right? It makes perfect sense, you're all resonating with that. Well, it seems to me we're now in a situation where those kinds of things are actively being undermined. Forgive me for the moment of going a little political, but I just want to set the stage for this. What we are seeing is that we're reverting on carbon emissions by reinvesting in fossil fuel and development of fuel, fossil fuel development and other development, which essentially puts the foot on the gas as we're going over what we can cope with. Many of us have already experienced a cut in funding. Just before I came here, I was looking at some numbers from the most recent budget proposal that came out of the White House, which includes cuts like 63% cut for for EPA, 58% for NOAA. Those are the agencies that fund the work you're talking about, right? 60% cut, 64% for NSF, the National Science Foundation. NASA, I heard, all your remote sensing that you want to draw on, well, it takes a little money to keep those satellites up there, right? So that's the kind of stuff that we're facing. Technical assistance is being taken away, and so on and so forth. There was a lot of the stop and go, right? Project that had already been funded, got stop orders. And then there's all kinds of ways in which I think things are being made harder, whether that's fueling social divisions and undermining the social cohesion that you're so heavily trying to work. All the efforts that are currently underway, I think, are aggravating some of the inequities that we're already facing. False information, misinformation, calling things like climate change a hoax, right? It's not helping us in our efforts to actually get people around the table and talk constructively about what we're doing, or not allowing certain voices to still speak. fostering fear, uncertainty with all that is, and in some ways that's resulting in an undermining of our sense of empowerment to do it. And we've seen with reduction in funding, particularly for FEMA, and basically delegating resilience building to states and local governments, that essentially we're delegating, we're devolving the governance for resilience to that level, but not with the funding that goes with it. So it's actually really difficult to do that work if you don't have the support. So I guess what that leads me to is there must be something else, what I would call a tense must know, that gets at why do we do that? You all in this room have this particular mindset. And how I would describe it is that you actually are prioritizing life and life support systems. You want that to survive. You want and do reckon with the legacies of what have we done in the past, whether it was what we heard this morning in terms of how the native peoples of this land who have stewarded this land for a long time, how they have managed versus what we have done, right? Reckoning with that and rectifying it. And then also knowing that this is going to be hard work. We're on an exponential curve with sea level rise, with climate change. It's not going to get easier or slower in the next several generations, the way things are going. How do we keep going? That's the question that I want to look at. And what would you say? Is at the heart of that hope or something else? I'm going to leave that cliffhanger to get me to the end of my presentation. But I want to focus and start with this mindset. What we typically focus on here, this is the stuff that all day long, that's what we've been talking about. What are the policies in place? How are we doing it? The practices? Who has the money? What is the money that's needed to make it work, right? That's the kind of structural material factors that determine what we can do. But why is it that some of you have that and some of you have less than that, or others have even less than that, right? It depends really on who makes the decision and what are the relationships among the people around the table, right? So that's the, if you will, the hidden causes behind maybe some injustices or unsustainability. And why are those people at a table? Why are the dynamics between those people the way they are? It's because of how people think about the world. It's the deepest cause, oftentimes something that we keep in a taboo, right? We struggle with it, we see it around the tables, but we don't actually address it. So these six factors, if you will, are the things that keep systems in place, right? If we think like, oh, let's just keep it the way we've always done it, well, then all the rest of it flows from there, and it will not change, right? If we wanted to change who gets money, well, we have to change who sits at the table and how these people think and interact with each other. So it gets ultimately to how do we approach this from an interior place? What are our beliefs, our worldviews, our sense of justice, our values that allow us to maybe shift things a little bit? So I've done a little bit of work over the last 15 years or so, being an advisor to an international research project on social transformations. And then as that project or program wound down, I was asked to synthesize what we have learned. And one of the things we've seen in all these case studies that were done is that every transformation actually begins with an ending. That's kind of sounds maybe weird, but the minute I explain it to you, it'll make sense to you, because we have to stop the old before we can put the new in place, right? Something has to be given up before we can make room for something else. So the way this looks, and maybe this sounds like America to you, but to me it sounds like first things actually fall apart, or we have to break them apart. We have to power down what we're doing. Think about changing from fossil fuels to renewables. We don't do it all at once, but at least we're winding some down, right, while we're ramping up the others so that we still have the energy that we need. That makes a lot of sense to me. Sometimes that means unlearning how we have done things, right? I've always done it this way. well, maybe I need to rethink that. That's what I mean by undoing the old before you begin something else. And before you begin the else, there's also a deep reckoning. Like, what have we done here? You know, I'm thinking about how we opened the day. How have we treated indigenous peoples in this state, in this country, for so long? There's some deep reckoning we have to do with that. It's not pleasant, and it is absolutely necessary if we wanted to change it. What have we done with slavery in this country? How do we change that? That's the deep reckoning, and then we can begin the work of repairing, innovating, experimenting, doing something different. A second one is that during that time, when you kind of have to give up what you always knew how to do, right? When things were just so and you could count on it, and you give that up, it's gonna be really uncertain because you don't know, where are we going? If it's something that you can figure out from how to get from here to there, it's not transformation. Transformation is something where you have to let go the railing, if you will, before you can hold on to the next thing. You don't know yet what's the new thing coming because of all these processes. And let me show you how this looks in the human psyche, right? And you probably all relate to this. So imagine this is same shape, right? You have to first let go. You feel the uncertainty. You lose confidence. How are we doing this? It might be confused. It might be depressing even. All these things because you can't see the new horizon yet. You can't know what's the good on the other side. The best I can tell you is it never just goes down. There will be a way out of this on the other side. We just tend to forget that. So there will come a crisis, there will come this reckoning, and eventually you will have enough room to begin the new. So all of that is deeply power-laden. We only need to look in the news what that means. It's absolutely, this is where all the forces are struggling for what kind of future do we want. And it's not just, oh, let me shift this gadget to the next gadget. It is actually very complex ecologies. What I mean by that, not the ecologies you're talking about. I'm talking about, say you want to move a home or a bunch of homes from sea level rise and move that back to somewhere safer. Well, you're moving lifeways. You're moving family histories. You're moving regulation. You're moving infrastructure. You're moving all of those things at the same time, right? So it's very complex what you actually need to accomplish in this. What's interesting is that people, this is what these studies show, that people are actually incredibly tolerant of things being really rotten for a really long time. We live in misery. We live with bad health care. We live with, bad education or lack of investment in education for a really long time before we say enough is enough. There will come that point, and it has come in every human society that people say enough is enough. But until then, you see things being in flux. Some people resist, some people just cope with it, and some people want to innovate and do the new thing. It is often when people reach that point of, I can't handle this anymore, when they start saying, okay, let's do something different. So it's a really important point. I wish it was otherwise and we could stop a lot sooner before that kind of suffering. But what's interesting is that to get to that point, there's a lot of work in the deep that you don't see. That is the mindset work that you don't see, right? And still it is happening. So I want to talk a little bit to you about what is that work in the deep that we don't see. It's a little bit, this is springtime, so you might be able to relate to this. But I love this little poem from Rumi who says, don't think the garden loses its ecstasy in winter. It's quiet, but the roots down there are riotous. That's what I'm talking about. In the deep, there's a lot of things going on. It is complex, it's lengthy, it unfolds over time. It involves a lot of actors that need to come into this, and it is happening actually at varying scales, right? What you do locally, what you do personally, what you do at the state, at the federal level, and on it goes. So when I reviewed all this material, what struck to me is that people kept doing the same kind of work over and over in these projects that work toward transformation. And I called it transformative labor. Probably many of you are familiar with the term emotional labor, right? You've heard this term of having to essentially keep a stiff upper lip in order to keep your job as a waitress or as an airline stewardess or whatever, right? That kind of, whether or not you're being treated nicely by the customers, right? But that's kind of what's expected. This is sort of an equivalent to that, except you're not trying to keep the job, you're trying to change the whole thing. You're trying to change the entire system that you're working in. So the inner and outer, visible and invisible work that's required to initiate, affect, navigate the difficult processes involved in transformative change. And when I looked around, what were these processes? It basically came down to these 7 here. Oftentimes it starts with somebody saying, this is really bad. And that's actually the place where scientists, and we just heard that, right? The problem statement. Actually identifying and naming that something is deeply wrong is a really important thing, especially when you're not, say, politically supported. When it's not, oh yeah, please tell me all about how the world is going to hell in a handbasket, people don't necessarily want to hear it, right? So naming that is a really important piece in this process. And then creating spaces like this, or smaller workspaces, these little places where communities get to interact, where you learn to collaborate, where you begin to vision. That's another one of these. Visioning, what is it we want? Or as often is the case, training people, teaching people in how to do things differently. Sometimes it's real life skills and how do I grow my own food, right? Or how do we work together? How do we resolve conflicts together? So some of it is real capacity building, real building the agency and the empowerment. Another case, or another bucket, if you will, is to actually take the first little steps. And that often is much easier done together. When people don't feel so isolated, but they do it together. You all talked about this all along. So moving toward that, recording that, talking about it. And all along the way, because it's hard work, is an effort in caring and tending to the community as you do the work. Really important. So, when I think about the reserve system, so much of that, yeah, you call it training, yeah, you call it education, but it's bringing teachers together to help them, find other teachers so that they don't feel so alone as they do the work, right? That's tending, that's caring for each other, checking in with each other. How is it going after the storm, or whatever the case may be. And then the last one that you see on the outside is scaling up, scaling out, scaling deep. Scaling up, you all know, seeing what you can do at the next level up, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Scaling out, replicating the things that are working in more places. Scaling deep is that work of reckoning with, is it working? Do we need to dig deeper? What's not yet done? Okay, so that's the kind of work that I kept seeing. None of it makes headlines. And it's probably the most important work that you'll ever do, this kind of deep work. So I talked about the scale. There is something that can happen at higher levels of scale that can support these local experiments in transformation. And I've sort of colored them in the same way so you can see what the sort of correspondences are, whether it's learning from what others have done and making the connections, linking to broader visions of sustainability. So yours is an example of that broader thing. It's good to know that other people are working on these things at the same time, right? Creating alliances across scale or across distances, building capacity and sense of empowerment at other scales. None of it is like you don't transform just here, otherwise it just stays that little bubble that has no connection to anything else. So there's a correspondence, as I said, and what I want to say is in the context of, a sort of hostile environment in which many of you are working now, many of us are working now, some of that work is shielding your community from that or putting up some resistance, right? Basically protecting your efforts against what is happening. And there are many, many strategies that can be employed to that. Okay, so let's just take stock of where we are right now. So transformation, I think, is inevitable one way or another. Either we choose it, or it's going to come to us, and we'll simply have to work with whatever we're given. It's really difficult. It's never guaranteed to succeed because it's a long and ongoing process. The most important work you do in that regard is away from the limelight, but there are these patterns, and you can probably recognize a lot of your own work in the 7 buckets of transformative labor. Now you might say, thank you very much, that's a lot to take on at the end of the day. And it does feel, for the most part, and you know, I grew up in Germany, on the eve of the day before the wall came down, none of us knew the wall would come down. None of us knew it would come down. People have been in the streets for, you know, months and months and months prior to that. But then there was this one moment and it happened, right? So this is what I mean. It looks impossible until it's done, and I guess we can take it from someone who was 28 years in prison. So what that leaves me with is, this is what we talked about all day. This is the work you're absolutely, you know, excellent about already. And I think to get to the transformation, the bigger task is the one that we just all named at the end in this panel. The trust building, the relationship building, the you know, collaboration, engaging people, having them come down to the site, right? Meeting them where they're at, dealing with their individual concerns, their individual fears. In many ways, you know, that means that you might be an engineer, you might be an ecologist, or whatever your training is, and all of a sudden you find yourself in caring for people, not in your day job description, right? And still, it's the work that we all do. It might change how you think about yourself, right? It might expand who you are. And in many ways, it is what will help you is if you can tap into people's hope and their need for, their desire for hope. Is there a chance? Are we going to get out of this? So the radical work that I want to propose that is in front of you is this, to basically make hope possible, to give people a vision of it, to help people find the vision for it, as opposed to, oh, it's all terrible. If that's how you leave from my talk tonight, I hope I'm not going to do that. That was my goal for this talk, and I'm going to share with you ways in which you can do that for hope, and maybe more than that. I've been asked about hope for, probably 10 years now. How do you keep hope going, right? Climate change is so terrible. How do you communicate that in a way that is actually convincing? So, you know, I'm a geek. I studied a lot of books, tried to understand what does it take to build hope. And I guess what I want to first start out with is to say there are different flavors and understandings of what hope is. The first kind is what you might call Pollyanna hope, or what some people simply call optimism, which is, it's going to be fine, right? I don't have to do much, it's going to be fine. How many of you think that's what's going to be? None. Okay, class dismissed. The second one is active hope, or active optimism, the idea of heroic hope. And what that is, you know, it's going to be fine, but it's going to take all of us making heroic efforts. How many of you think that's what it's going to take? Okay, I see a few more hands going up. All right, you're keeping room for whatever is to come. Very good. All right, here's the next thing. Passive skepticism, or stoic hope. What that means, basically, is, you know, I'm not sure it's going to be so fine, but I think we're Americans, we're going to stick through it, we can make it, right? You're going to basically live through whatever is going to be given. How many of you think that's what it's going to take? Okay, few more hands, all right. Let's see, you've got 2 more options. Active skepticism or grounded hope. What that is you're not at all convinced it's going to be fine, and you're going to have to do whatever it takes to make the best thing possible. That is, you know, whatever it takes. You can't get up out of the, I see your thing, you can't get out of bed in the morning unless that's what you dedicate yourself to. How many of you think that's what it takes? Okay, I see a few more hands. Holding out for the last one. Radical hope. This is a concept that comes from an anthropologist named Jonathan Lear at Harvard. And what I would call that is active transformation. And that is the idea that you don't know what it's going to take, and you don't know whether it's going to turn out good, but you have to dig very, very deep to essentially keep going through not knowing the what and not knowing the how. How many of you think that's what it's going to take? There's a few more hands. Probably somewhere between grounded hope and the radical hope is probably what we need, right? I'm going to tell you what my definition of hope is, which has come out of all this reading. And I guess maybe, let me go back here one second to say, I actually love this picture, and I've chosen it for a reason, which is, think about it. This is people rowing together, right? Number one, we're not doing this alone. And interestingly enough, in which direction are they going? To the thing they can't see, right? You don't exactly know what's coming, but you're doing it together, and who knows, you know, you're on a pretty unsteady surface to begin with. So that makes more sense than with my definition. Standing on this ever-changing foundation of uncertainty and change, hope arises from the tension between a deep understanding of history, looking backwards, how was it done in the past, and a bold vision of an unwritten future. It is motivation experienced in the present combined with an ability to see far, in other words, having a vision, being able to see that, a commitment and the ability to contribute constructively to building that desirable future. How do we do that? So those are the three big elements that I just have in this. Uncertainty and change is the foundation, a desirable future, and a sense of agency. There are many things. I'm not going to speak to everything, but there are many things you can do in terms of, you know, what is that future that we're trying to get to? Fostering the imagination, expanding the circle of who gets to say what that future ought to be. The story this morning about the circle of elders, 80 people speaking to what is it they want. That to me was an example of that, instead of just having the 5 that always show up, right? That kind of expansion is what I'm talking about. The uncertainty, how do we stay with that? How do we stay nimble, expect surprises, tracking progress so we have a finger on the pulse of what's happening, breaking big goals down to smaller ones so we can achieve them, and expanding people's idea of what's possible. And just in the interest of time, going a little bit beyond sort of the agency, one of the things that, you know, I keep hearing a lot here was building it together. Let's do it together. We feel much greater agency, as psychology would tell us, if we do it together than if we don't. Now I want to bring that back. That's the building the hope part, right? My talk is entitled, Is Hope Enough? I think with what I just put out there will get you a long way, especially with the idea of authentic, grounded, and radical hope. But we're no longer in a supportive environment to do this work. What will it take us to keep going? I call that climate courage. And just to say, what do I mean by, I'm into definitions. What do we mean by courage? Well, it's basically faced with a grave risk, choosing to confront it, so it's a very active choice, in pursuit of a valued, if uncertain, outcome. When you ask people, like, what do you understand how courage works, there's always a measure of free will. You don't compel anyone to do something like this, then we call it something else, right? But when it's voluntary that you choose to engage a risk, that's what we call volition, having free will. You always have to confront a risk or some high stakes, and you do it because something important is worth doing it, right? If you're running into a burning house to bring out a kid on the second floor, it's because you value the life of that child, no matter what it does to your life. Climate courage is then the willingness to take action in the face of climate change aimed at positive inner and outer change, despite the risk, despite the discomfort and opposition. So I'll just quickly say, these are the basic types of courage that people distinguish, and you all recognize this, right? Moral courage in this instant would be speaking out in the face of attacks or isolation, political opposition. Psychological courage, to actually face the discomfort of, wow, these are existential risks we're facing. That takes some guts. Living through the impacts unfolding while helping others, or facing this again and again and again. Right? That is basically what climate courage is. How do we build that? I'm not going to have time to speak in this in detail. If you want to hear more, I've written about it. Happy to share that. But it's a lot of grounding in yourself, with others, in your connection to Earth, learning to be with the emotions that we're facing and doing that together, not alone, building some very practical skills and situational awareness, preventing and healing from burnout, because how could we possibly rest, right? And then the last bit is actually learning from it and being willing and ready to transform ourselves in this process. So I'll just end here with these resources in case you're interested in reading up in any of this stuff, and happy to answer questions if we have time for it. Yeah? Okay, thank you. If you have questions, I guess the job is to raise your hand so that the microphone can come to you. I have talked them all to death. Okay. It's been a long day. There's a question? Sorry. Oh, there is one right here.
I'm just going to sneak around. Oh.
Hi. I was just wondering if, in the face of more and more uncertainty and fear and some of these negative things that are happening, if you've noticed that people have become more compassionate to each other. Because I feel that's something that I feel like I've noticed, even in, the restoration community, is that we often are coming to each other much more realistically and as real people.
I think in the places where people know each other, I see that. So, if you put together people, whether it's in a community, in a workplace or whatever, I definitely see that there. And COVID, I think, helped a little bit, in terms of just humanizing our work, right? Where I don't see it is that there are factions within society that have never met each other, and we can be very, very negative toward each other. The polarization has only increased, and I don't see a lot of real attempts to try to break those down. There are probably the exception to that, a few people trying to break down those barriers and come together, but sometimes it happens sort of in the context of a crisis, like a disaster, Helene or whatever, if you think about some of those examples. But by and large, there is still a deepening of the divisions in some factions of society. So it's a mixed picture in my observation. There's one back there.
Thanks, Susie. That was really great. My question is with regard to your climate courage definition. Do you have examples of where that's happening here in the U.S. that we can look to think about how people are exhibiting climate courage and where to find that bravery and look for this inspiration?
Yeah, actually a lot of them. So, for example, scientists speaking out against, basically what they're seeing and it not being taken seriously or being slandered and speaking out against that. There's something called the scientist rebellion. There are things like, is this how you feel? Those are websites you can look in this paper that I just wrote. There's a whole bunch of examples that I put in. So that's an example where scientists are speaking out against the kind of convention of how a scientist is supposed to behave, right? Youth activists, there's a ginormous wave of depression and anxiety among many young people, well documented. There are some that are saying, no, we're going to claim our future. And they're speaking up, they're taking the federal government to court, right? There are things that are pretty outrageously courageous in my book of where people are doing that. Even people like this goes back to the point we just had, like people breaking down those divisions and trying to speak to each other and meet each other one-on-one. Those examples exist. Trying to think of some other, God, I don't have it at the top of my head, but I have like 4 text boxes of examples of different categories. Oh, here's another one, and it comes from the adaptive mind work that you mentioned earlier. So, and I work with climate professionals who basically don't have the luxury to look away, and in and of itself, I think that's pretty tough to do, right? And having spaces where they actually step away from their, whatever the professional norms are for a technical profession, to come together and say, this is really hard, and to be honest about that, and meet each other and support each other. I've seen really wonderful connections that are formed by people stepping out of those comfort zones and supporting each other, supporting their colleagues, supporting the community in a new way. I've seen it between professors and their students, really stepping out of sort of these very narrow roles that we have and becoming fully human in the process. So yeah, I think I see those. And scientists or journalists speaking out when their publications get slammed or shut down or whatever, and finding new ways. Those are all examples, I think. And I think there are lots of places to go. I mean, so many of us have chosen silence. And for people to begin to break that and say, let's have this conversation, all of a sudden finding, my God, you think that the same way? That's the kind of stuff that I'm seeing. And I think we really need that to feel not so alone. I mean, that's the strategy of every military leader, right? Divide and conquer. And what we do instead is we come together and find our common humanity again and work toward the restoration of life. This is coming back to the mindset that it takes. So I see it in places. I think we need a lot more of it. Yeah, Tanya. I'm giving away all my microphones, so if I keep doing that.
I just want to make sure there weren't any other hands taking the microphone. But Susie, thank you so much for your presentation. A lot of deep things to reflect on. And I'm not sure I got all of it, but one thing that struck me is that even in the spectrum of different types of hope that you laid out for us, the one thing I'm wrestling with is that all of them still have a measure of hope, right? Whether it's the Pollyanna kind or the heroic kind or all the way down, the fight for it kind. And so I wonder if you could, maybe I just missed this, expound on what that is, because to me, all of us in the room have to carry that hope, right? Whether we're on, we have to be the instruments of hope in the work that we're doing, wherever we fall on that spectrum, because it is such a deep thing that comes from the well of your being in terms of how you do that work, whether it's the resilience work or the climate work. I think that we're not talking about water quality today, but we're still struggling with that deep thing. Like, I am like 20 years at the reserve, and my first workshop was about water quality. We're still wrestling with that. So I'm saying that the work, we have to be that inspiration for change. So to me, I saw that as one continuous thread. We still need that hope so that we don't lose despair and give up. However that gets manifested in the daily. So I just wondered if you could talk about keeping hope alive, because I feel like, at least from where I sit, we still need that in the depths of wherever we are, where it feels like, oh, this is hard work. It is complex work. It is to be transformative. It takes transforming ourselves sometimes to really make that change. So I apologize for speaking when we should be giving the microphone to others, but that was just really burning within me.
No, I think it's a really great question. And the truth of the matter is probably all of you in the room, including myself, have actually felt despair, right? And to actually acknowledge that is, I think, an important piece. That might not be what you want to take out back into your community or in the workshops that you run or whatever, but I just want to sort of normalize that against this spectrum of tremendous change that is coming, I mean, we've seen the least of it. We're still on the upswing of the exponential curve. So quite frankly, I think there's a lot more coming, and it can be overwhelming and despairing. So I think that's the first thing I want to say. The second one is that, so many of us in leadership positions carry this alone, carry the burden of having to keep up hope by ourselves. And I think that's probably a really, I think it's not a sustainable way of going through this. So doing these things together, I personally have a group of people where I can let it hang out and let it, name it how it is, how I really feel without being judged, so that then I can sort of come back to what matters to me. What's the deepest values that I want to come from in this work, right? Regardless of outcome, right? It's not about outcome. All the things on the right of that spectrum, those were not it's going to be fine. It's going to probably not be fine. But what am I going to dedicate myself to every morning, right? And I just need a place to come back to, I guess, to regroup, to maybe step back sometimes, take a break, restore. I don't know, I read a lot of poetry, I listen to a lot of music, I need friends, I go on walks in the morning, so those are the things, the practices that keep me going so that I can go back in. And I think what people mostly pick up is not what I say, but that they sense a kind of resilience from that, and that's what people then pick up on and take it back to in their own lives. So having spaces, doing it not by yourself, and having a place you can be honest, I think is probably 90% of it.